So, Steve, thank you very much for joining me on the pilot episode of Bankrupt. As a general overview of your time at Pan Am, what was that like for you?
Well, it was absolutely spectacular. I had actually grown up flying on Pan Am. When I was 6 weeks old, I took my first flight on Pan Am when we moved to Brazil, and then later on we moved to Australia. So I was very familiar with Pan Am as a passenger. I'd actually logged about 500,000 miles before I got hired by Pan Am. The cool thing was when I got hired in 1979, I was based out of Miami because my native language is Portuguese. On one of my first flights, I was telling the senior purser that, hey, I flew on this flight in 1952 when I was 6 weeks old. And he says, I probably held you in my arms. He says, I used to work that flight all the time. So that was the way my career started, was pretty much flying the same routes that I flew as a passenger when I was a kid.
All the former employees I've talked to who've worked on Pan Am as a pilot or a flight attendant or even in corporate, they've all had phenomenal things to say about the airline. And that's pretty rare for a mega company like Pan Am was. Why do you think that is?
Pan Am really was a family airline. You know, a lot of big companies, you sort of get lost in the shuffle. If the company's really large, you're just a number. Pan Am was a family airline. It was started by Juan Tripp, and he and his wife used to fly the airline all the time, and they treated all of us employees like we were family. And I think that's one of the reasons that people loved flying with Pan Am so much. Not just the way the corporation treated us, but all of us employees treated each other as family. That's the way we felt about each other. And I think that's why people loved working for Pan Am so much.
Could you briefly talk about some of the experiences you've had with Pan Am?
Well, actually, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about my flying for Pan Am called Flying in the Pool, because I had so many wild experiences. I highlight a lot of things in my book that are sort of scary flights, and there's also a lot of fun flights. But probably the most notable thing I ever did was I got asked by scheduling to fly a spy mission. And just myself and two pilots from the IGS, Pan Am's Internal German Service, flew two CIA agents into Beirut, Lebanon, when the Marines were occupying the airport there. And I managed to photograph everything. So that was quite an experience, because our airplane was actually under threat of being shelled the whole time that we were on the ground. And some of the photographs that I took of the Marines surrounding our airplane were probably the last photograph ever taken of some of them, because there was the bombing of the U.S. barracks about 2 months after we were there, and 241 guys were killed. Wow. So that was a pretty memorable experience. I had another flight that was pretty hairy. I refer to it in my book as Voyage into the Twilight Zone, because we had our DC-10 sabotaged in Athens. There was a ground mechanic that it looks like he sliced the tires on three tires on our airplane, and so we landed in Boston. We almost ran off the runway, and the captain was so shaken up by the whole ordeal. Anyway, the bottom line is they couldn't get the plane fixed for us to leave Boston unless us stewards went down and helped the mechanics change the tires. So that was really a pretty rare experience, and again, I photographed that whole thing, so it's a pretty memorable experience for me. And then, of course, I had a whole lot of fun flights. Probably the most fun flight I ever did is I got a charter to Tahiti, and that was pretty rare back when I was flying, because Tahiti was no longer on the regular schedule, and it was a lot of fun. Three of us guys and a whole bunch of gals, and we managed to go down to Tahiti and had a 4-day layover just laying in the sun before we had to work a flight back to Los Angeles. That's the kind of thing that you really remember when you think about your career with Pan Am.
Yeah. Well, you joined in the later years of Pan Am, right where it was after it reached its peak in the late 60s and early 70s. And after the early 70s, that's when the oil crisis happened, and it really put Pan Am into a huge financial crisis. So it's interesting. Were there any red flags for you while you were working for Pan Am that kind of indicated that the company was going through financial troubles?
Well, when I started flying in 1979, it was a rumor that you heard all the time, we're going broke, we're going broke. I heard that from day one when I was hired in 79. But really nothing happened financially to the company until about 4 or 5 years later. It was about 1984 when I was flying out of New York. I was working as a departure control supervisor for a few months, and the company tapped me on the shoulder to go show some United Airlines people how our Pan Am 747 SP and our L1011 worked. So I spent the whole day touring these people through our airplane, and then I realized at the end of the day when they sent me a commendation letter, I had just hired my replacements. Pan Am was literally going to sell those airplanes to United Airlines.
Really?
That was a pretty strong indication that things were going downhill. And that was around 1984.
Right. Jeez. Could you talk a little bit about Flight 103 and your experience with it?
Well, in 1988, I was based out of Los Angeles, and I started dating a stewardess, a new hire stewardess. They're called Silver Wingers. I was dating a new hire stewardess named Jocelyn Reyna that was based out of London. And on December the 21st, I was laying over in San Diego. I was doing West Coast shuttles. And when we went out to the airplane the next morning, we're sitting in the terminal waiting for our plane to board, and a gate agent comes over to us with this long list. And he says one of our planes just went down. And so, of course, we're all crazily perusing the list, looking for names of people that we might know. And, of course, it was Pan Am 103 that had just gone down. There's supposed to be 12 flight attendants on an airplane, on a 747, 10 stewards, stewardesses, and 2 pursers. This crew had 13 names on it. The last name was added in pencil, and it was my fiancée, Jocelyn Reyna. So that was a pretty devastating event, and I ended up actually retiring from Pan Am shortly after that because it was very difficult for me to be out near airports and just flying. So my career ended in May of 1989, just a few months after Pan Am 103 happened. But that pretty much ended my life and my career as far as my personal relationship went with Jocelyn Reyna.
My condolences to the loss, and that's a truly tragic event. So you're saying that you left in the late 80s, and only a few years later was actually the time where Pan Am declared bankruptcy, and soon after in that year, in December, it ceased all operations. So what was that like for you, seeing this entire enormous company just come to an end so abruptly?
Well, the company had been struggling, as you mentioned, financially for a couple, 3 years before the very end. And so what they were trying to do is entice a bunch of us A-scalers to quit. And they were hiring B-scale flight attendants, people for less than half what they were paying us, to replace us. So a whole bunch of us took advantage of the early out, as they called it. And so many of us retired in 1989, 1990. Of course, we were all counting on getting flight benefits, medical benefits, and our retirement pay.
Right.
So one morning, everybody wakes up in 1991, and nothing. Everything came to a grinding halt. Our retirement pay gone.
Really?
Of course, all of our flight benefits, medical benefits, all gone, just instantly. So it was a pretty devastating event when it happened, not only for the people still flying, but for many of us that went already retired, expecting that the company was probably going to continue in business even though it was struggling. It was quite a shock to everybody. I, of course, kept in contact with a lot of the people that I had flown with. And the most shocking thing that I heard from people was many of the crews that were overseas at the time that Pan Am went bankrupt. The next morning, no phone call for pickup. When you called out to operations, just an answering machine saying Pan Am was out of business.
So everything just stopped.
All of those flight attendants, pilots, engineers had to pay their own way home. Some cases from halfway around the world. And the most shocking thing was, as I was told by a lot of these crews that were still flying, when they went out to the terminal, you would expect that you could go over to another airline and get a discount ticket, because we always used to have reciprocal tickets. Nothing. The instant Pan Am went out of business, everybody had to pay full fare in order to get their way home. So it was actually a horrible experience for everybody, financially as well as emotionally.
So, well, that's interesting. I'll make this the last question. Who kind of blames Pan Am for the downfall? Do employees, people who used to work at Pan Am, do they blame management? Do they blame the times? What's the culprit for people internally?
Well, I think everybody has their favorite culprit,
yeah.
and it's not the same one for everybody. Because a lot of people have just a small understanding of how an airline worked, and so whatever is in their purview, that's what they're going to point the finger at. Certainly, the fuel crisis had an awful lot to do with it. But like I said, when I was hired in '79, the rumors were already going around that the company was going broke, and we went through 4 CEOs during my 10 years. Well, that's a pretty good indication that management doesn't really have a handle on how to run an airline. So my perspective is, when people ask me, my first choice is to blame management. We just had poor management. We had Wall Street people that had never worked for an airline running an airline.
Right.
So they really had no clue how to run an airline, especially when it was struggling. But of course, also the fuel crisis was a huge part of it. And then there were also some poor decisions made. I'm hesitant to talk about this one because it does create a lot of angst. But Pan Am merged with National Airlines in 1980.
Right. Very mismanaged is what I've heard.
There ended up being two divisions of Pan Am, the Blue Division and the Orange Division. The Orange Division being National. All of the standards that Pan Am had put in place for 50, 60 years, when they merged with National, those standards just evaporated, because we were all of a sudden acquiring a huge body of employees that didn't have the background and the standards that Pan Am required to be hired. So many people blame the merger with National as the real downfall, not only because things changed dramatically with the employees and the standards that we had, but also all of a sudden, overnight, we had twice as many airplanes that we ever had before. And many of those were inefficient airplanes. The DC-10s were just inefficient. They didn't work out. And so for about 4 to 5 years, until Pan Am could straighten out the merger and dump all of the inefficient stuff, things kept getting worse and worse and worse, and so they just never recovered.